A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com.
Hey Herman and Corin, so it is about 11 o'clock here in Jerusalem on, well, I've lost track of the days. This situation, the war, has been going on for so long. Everyone is at the end of their tether. It's Sunday, the first day of the week here in Israel. And it is, as I'm recording this prompt, 23:07 local time. Oh, and I have the UTC time as well. 20:07 Zulu time. So just after 11 p.m. at night time. And something I did at the start of this conflict, so I've been driven kind of crazy, having lived through this war and the previous war, with this question of, I mentioned that when the sirens go off here in Israel, in Jerusalem, if you don't have a public shelter, you have more or less got 3 minutes to get maximum, well, sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's as little as 1. So when they say every minute counts or every second counts, it's really not a cliche. Every second counts, and especially we have a young child. So imagine if a siren goes off at 3 in the morning. It's happened plenty of times. From the very second that siren wakes you up, you need to not only get out of your house in 3 minutes, you need to be at public shelter, which generally means getting somewhere at least 2 stories underground. So picture yourself basically running across a block in any city, and that's pretty much what it is. So that's why I've kind of been, I would say, looking for any kind of way to get awareness of what's happening with the missiles without being driven crazy. And the news drives me crazy. I discovered after the first war last summer, day one, governmental news is great. And then after 2 hours, you're already exhausted because it's non-stop, back-to-back coverage speculation. So the closest I've come to having something actually genuinely useful that I couldn't get from other sources is what I'm looking at. It's a dashboard that lights up and it shows the red alerts as they come in from around the country. They go red or orange if it's a warning. And the usefulness of this is generally, from having lived through this, well, this been going on for a month at this point. You get to learn the patterns. And if you're just looking at the red alerts in your area, you just see if it's specifically your geography, you'll get it. But if there's, a significant amount of territory lighting up, it's basically an attack is underway. And Israel is not such a big place. So if they start somewhere, they often kind of, it's a great situational awareness thing, because just at a glance by looking at this TV, you see a lot of red lit up that something is going on. Now, to get to the point, I've been watching this TV for the last 5 days, and exactly about this time, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, through to midnight, the Iranians are trying to hit Dimona, the nuclear site, and it's basically a relatively small polygon. The alerting areas, each one is defined as a polygon, and you'll see maybe 8 or 10 of these, but it's usually, as far as I can tell, the same ones, broadly speaking. So it's like a concerted attempt. The closest they've come so far is the Iranians struck Arad, which is really a bizarre target. I measured it to be about 23 kilometers from Dimona. The Dimona nuclear plant, it's not a state secret where it's located. It's on Google Maps. It's not in the town of Dimona itself, which was hit. It's about, I think, 7 or 8 kilometers from it. So that's as close as they've come. But you'd kind of struggle to think these are kind of these back and beyond towns in Israel, why you would target a patch of desert for any other reason, whether it's Dimona or military sites in that area. It seems like a very clear plan. Now, here's what I want to ask Herman and Corin. one of the great things that I've got from listening to these episodes and reading some of the sources I've recommended, like the ISW, is everything in warfare like this is calibrated. And it wouldn't be logical for Iran to send these volleys night after night after night if they weren't trying to do something different, I think. And we've talked a lot about the idea of probing that happens a lot. Like sometimes you'll have different tactics that are used in order to try to glean little morsels of information about the way that missiles were intercepted or defended against that actually might be primarily intended to be useful for future attacks, which actually is a very interesting idea, I think. Looking at a missile attack not as an attempted kinetic strike, but as an intelligence gathering exercise, with the missile being the sensor as such. So, Herman and Corn, I'll turn this one over to you. We see these patterns of missiles that, looking at the targets in Israel, Arad, some of them are obvious, right? The airport, an oil refinery, and some of them are kind of just perplexing. They're random places, and none of the otherwise very informative sources I follow has had any idea as to what's going on. But let's assume for a second that this isn't all random. We've talked about CEP, the error of margin in missile attacks. We've talked about deflection and tactics like that. And we saw one in Jerusalem recently that ended up falling 400 meters from the Dome of the Rock, which really is actually a very, very strange thing to happen, because Al-Aqsa Mosque is just is on the dome. So even if you say they were targeting the Western Wall, it can't really be targeted without also hitting the Dome of the Rock. So there's no real logical explanation for what the target was. So Herman and Corn, what do you think might be going on with these Iranian attacks? Obviously, we hope that they're intercepted. But I think a lot of us here who spend our nights and days watching, waiting, getting alerts, running to shelter, coming back from shelter, we wonder sometimes, what are they actually trying besides hitting places? What are the strategies being probed with these otherwise sometimes very random, but sometimes very predictable and repeat exercises of attempted ballistic missile force?
It is one thing to read a headline about a missile barrage, but it is another thing entirely to watch the data in real time. When you see those red polygons lighting up a dashboard night after night, you realize you're not just looking at a map of danger, you are looking at a language. Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that, the tactical and strategic logic behind these persistent Iranian ballistic missile patterns we have been seeing over the last week, specifically those odd, repetitive alerts around Dimona and Jerusalem.
It is a heavy topic, Corn, but a necessary one because the traditional media coverage is failing to explain the why. By the way, for those curious about the nuts and bolts of how we are putting this together, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have spent the last 48 hours digging into the telemetry and the historical doctrine of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to figure out why they are hitting the same empty patches of desert at 11 p.m. every single night.
It is eerie, right? Daniel mentioned that for the last 5 days, between 10 p.m. and midnight, these alerts just start popping up like clockwork. 8 to 10 polygons forming this specific box around the Negev, specifically near Arad and the Dimona nuclear facility. If you are a civilian, you are just thinking about getting to the shelter within that 1 to 5 minute window. But if you are a military analyst, you're asking, why are they so consistent? Why that specific window? And why targets that seem to result in nothing but sand being kicked up 23 kilometers away from the actual facility?
That is the core of the mystery. In a world of expensive, high-end munitions, you do not just throw away ballistic missiles for the sake of a loud noise. Every launch has a cost, both economically and in terms of revealing your launch positions. If Iran is sending volleys night after night and they are not actually hitting the primary target, we have to stop looking at the explosions and start looking at the information. This is what we call missiles as sensors.
Missiles as sensors. It sounds like something out of a Silicon Valley pitch deck for a very dark startup. But I get the gist. You are saying the missile itself is the probe. It is not the end of the mission. It is the beginning of the data collection.
Precisely. Think about what happens the moment a ballistic missile enters Israeli airspace. The entire multi-layered defense architecture wakes up. You have the Green Pine radars for the Aero system, you have the X-band radars from the American-operated sites, and then you have David's Sling and Iron Dome for the terminal phase. Every time a missile flies a specific trajectory toward Dimona, it forces the Israeli Defense Forces to reveal their hand. They have to turn on specific radars, they have to use specific frequencies, and they have to launch interceptors from specific locations.
But wait, how much can they actually learn from a single flight path? If the IDF knows they are being watched, wouldn't they try to mask their response?
You'd think so, but you can't mask physics. If an interceptor is fired, it has to come from a physical battery. If a radar pulse hits a missile, that pulse radiates back and can be picked up by Iranian electronic intelligence ships in the Gulf, or signals intelligence sites in Syria. By repeating the same flight path 5 nights in a row, the IRGC isn't just getting a snapshot, they are getting a baseline. They are looking for the delta, the change in response time. If the intercept happens at 40,000 feet on Monday, but 35,000 feet on Tuesday, that tells them something about the local battery's readiness or the specific interceptor inventory being used.
So, if I'm the IRGC sitting in a command center in Tehran, I'm not just looking for a mushroom cloud. I'm looking at the electronic signature of the response. I'm timing how long it takes from launch to detection, and from detection to intercept. If I do that 5 nights in a row at the same time, I'm basically performing a stress test on the entire network.
It is a live-fire diagnostic. If you hit the same 8 to 10 polygons every night, you are mapping the saturation point of the local battery. You are seeing if the interceptors are coming from the same spot, or if the IDF is rotating their launch platforms. You are also checking for what we call radar shadows. The topography around the Negev and the Dead Sea is complex. You have deep craters, jagged ridges, and the massive drop to the lowest point on Earth. By slightly varying the angle of attack into those polygons near Arad, Iran can figure out exactly where the blind spots are in the radar coverage.
It's like someone walking around your house at night, not trying to break in, but just checking which motion sensor lights turn on and where the shadows stay dark.
And they are doing it with million-dollar equipment. This isn't just about finding a hole in the fence, it's about mapping the entire security system's logic. If they find a specific approach angle from the southeast that delays radar acquisition by even 6 seconds, that is the difference between an intercept and a direct hit on a hardened silo.
That explains the desert targets. It is a lot safer for Iran to probe a desert than to probe Tel Aviv if they are not ready for a total regional conflagration yet. They get the data, they claim they are attacking a quote-unquote strategic site, but they avoid the kind of mass civilian casualties that would trigger a decapitation strike on Tehran. But what about the Jerusalem anomaly Daniel mentioned? A missile falling 400 meters from the Dome of the Rock? That is not a desert. That is the most sensitive real estate on the planet.
That is where the concept of circular error probable, or CEP, comes in. CEP is the measure of a weapon system's precision. It is the radius of a circle within which half of the missiles are expected to land. Now, Iran has claimed for years that their newer missiles, like the Fatah or the Khaibar Shekan, have a CEP of under 30 meters. To prove that in a real combat environment, you need a target that is incredibly high stakes and physically small.
So they are using the Western Wall as a literal bullseye to see if they can thread the needle without hitting the Al-Aqsa Mosque or the Dome of the Rock. If they hit the dome, they lose the entire Muslim world's support. If they hit the wall, they achieve a massive symbolic victory. Falling 400 meters away is actually a huge failure if you're claiming 30-meter precision, but it is an invaluable data point for calibration.
It tells them their guidance systems are being jammed or deflected. In Jerusalem, the GPS spoofing is intense. The IDF has been transparent about the fact that they are messing with navigation signals across the country. If you open Google Maps in Tel Aviv right now, it might think you're at the airport in Beirut. If that Iranian missile fell 400 meters off target, the Iranian engineers now know exactly how much their inertial navigation system drifted when the GPS signal was lost. They can go back to the lab, adjust the algorithms, and try again. It is a terrifyingly practical way to iterate on your technology.
But isn't that incredibly risky? A 400-meter miss in the old city isn't a miss. In the traditional sense, it's a potential international catastrophe. If that missile had drifted 400 meters in the other direction, it could have leveled the holy site.
That's the fun fact of the day, if you can call it that. During the 1991 Gulf War, Iraq fired Scuds at Israel, and many of them were so inaccurate they landed in the West Bank. The IRGC has studied those failures. They aren't just firing and hoping anymore, they are using terminal guidance, meaning the missile has little flaps or fins that move to steer it as it falls. By aiming for Jerusalem, they are testing if those fins can overcome the GPS noise created by Israeli electronic warfare. It's a high-stakes lab experiment.
It is basically A-B testing with high explosives. But let's talk about the human cost of this iteration. Daniel mentioned the exhaustion, the 3 a.m. sirens, the 1 to 5 minutes to get to a shelter that might be 2 stories underground. Even if these missiles are just sensors, the psychological effect on the population is a weapon in its own right. It is a form of information attrition.
Information attrition is a perfect way to describe it. Most people think of attrition as wearing down tanks or soldiers, but here you are wearing down the decision-making capacity of the civilian population and the military leadership. If you trigger alerts every night between 10 and midnight, you are conditioning the population. You are creating a rhythm of fear. Eventually, people stop going to the shelter, they get complacent, or they get so stressed that they demand their government take reckless action.
Does this conditioning affect the soldiers too? I mean, the guys operating the Iron Dome or the Arrow batteries. If they see the same probe 5 nights in a row, do they start to relax?
That is exactly what the IRGC is betting on. It's called reflexive control. You feed your opponent information that leads them to make a predictable decision. If you show the radar operators a lazy missile every night at 11:00 p.m., they might become slightly slower to engage on night 6. Or, conversely, they might become so jumpy that they fire 3 interceptors at a single decoy, wasting millions of dollars and depleting their magazine. It's a game of chicken played at Mach 5.
And that is exactly what a probing campaign wants. You want to see how the enemy reacts when they are tired. Does the radar operator make a mistake on night 6? Does the government launch a retaliatory strike that is disproportionate and turns international opinion against them? It is all part of the same calculation.
We should look at the history here to understand why this is Iran's preferred mode of operation. If you go back to the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the War of the Cities, Iran learned that volume matters more than precision when your goal is to destabilize a society. But they also learned that they couldn't win a conventional war against a better funded air force, so they pivoted to this doctrine of strategic depth. They built an arsenal that allows them to reach out and touch any point in the Middle East without ever putting an Iranian pilot in the air.
So this is basically the evolution of that 80s doctrine, just with better microchips.
In the 80s, they just wanted to hit a city, any city. Now, they want to hit a specific room in a specific building, but they know they have to clear the digital hurdles first. It's the difference between a sledgehammer and a scalpel that's still being sharpened.
And now they have added this layer of technical sophistication. They aren't just firing Scuds anymore. They are firing sophisticated, multi-stage ballistic missiles that can perform terminal maneuvers. But Herman, I have to ask, is it possible we are over-intellectualizing this? Could it just be that their missiles actually suck? Maybe they are trying to hit Dimona and they keep missing by 23 kilometers because their tech is overhyped.
I love that you asked that because it is the most common counter-argument, and honestly, it is probably a mix of both. There is a high probability that some of these misses are genuine failures. We know that in previous volleys, a significant percentage of Iranian missiles suffered from launch failures or broke up upon re-entry. But when you see a pattern as consistent as the one Daniel described, the same polygons, the same time window, 5 nights in a row, that is not incompetence. That is a schedule. Incompetence is random. Strategy has a pulse.
So if it is a schedule, what is the next phase? If you have spent a week probing the Negev and trying to calibrate your CEP in Jerusalem, what are you building toward? Is there a night 7 we should be worried about?
Usually, the probing phase ends when the data stops changing. If the IRGC launches 10 missiles and the Israeli response is identical to the night before, the engineers in Tehran say, okay, we have the map. The next phase is either a de-escalation, where they stop and use the data for future leverage, or it's a saturation strike. A saturation strike is when you use all the holes you found. You send the drones in low to distract the short-range sensors, you send the ballistic missiles through the radar shadows you mapped, and you time it all to hit during a shift change or a period of high atmospheric interference.
It's the classic warfare as a service model we've discussed before, but refined for 2026. You use your proxies, the Houthis in the south and Hezbollah in the north, to provide the noise while you provide this signal. It's a terrifying prospect for anyone living in the crosshairs. Daniel mentioned using dashboards to stay aware without being overwhelmed. I think that is a fascinating survival mechanism in the digital age.
It really is. In the past, you just had the radio or the sirens. Now, you can actually see the geometry of the war. If you see a single polygon light up, maybe you stay in bed but keep your shoes on. If you see the entire center of the country light up, you know it is time to get Ezra and Hannah into that shelter immediately. It is about reclaiming a sense of agency through data.
But even that has a limit. You can only look at so many red dots before your brain just fries. I think there is a lesson here about the limits of situational awareness. You can know everything about the missile's trajectory, but you still can't control where it lands. How do people manage that mental load?
It's a phenomenon called threat fatigue. We saw it during the Blitz in London and during the Gulf War. People start to treat the sirens like a weather report. Oh, it's raining missiles in the Negev again. That's actually a very dangerous psychological state because it plays right into the hands of the attacker. If you stop taking the data seriously, the one time it's not a probe, you're caught out in the open.
That is the hard truth. But understanding the logic can at least remove some of the terror of the unknown. Knowing that these might be probes rather than a failed attempt at a total strike changes how you perceive the threat. It is a move in a very long, very grim game of chess.
It's also worth looking at the Jerusalem shield concept. Why does Jerusalem rarely get hit compared to Tel Aviv? It's not just the religious sites. The topography of Jerusalem, sitting on those hills, makes it a nightmare for low-flying cruise missiles, but a perfect calibration target for high-altitude ballistics. The Iranians know the Israelis will move heaven and earth to protect Jerusalem, which means the IDF will use their best, most secretive tech to defend it. So, by firing near Jerusalem, Iran gets to see Israel's A-team defense in action.
Let's pivot to the practical side of this. For people like Daniel, or anyone living in a high-conflict zone, what is the actual takeaway here? We've established that these missiles are sensors, and that the targets are likely part of a calibration exercise. How does that change how civilians should behave?
First, it means you have to respect the pattern but not be paralyzed by it. If you know the IRGC likes the 10 p.m. to midnight window, you plan your life around it. You make sure the shelter is ready, the bags are packed, and the kids are settled before that window opens. It sounds cynical, but it is about risk management. Second, it means you should be skeptical of the headlines. If the news says, quote, Iran fails to hit nuclear site, unquote, you should read that as, quote, Iran just gathered a week's worth of data on the nuclear site's defenses, unquote. It keeps you from falling into a false sense of security.
That is a crucial point. Complacency is the goal of a probing campaign. You want the enemy to think you're weak so they stop paying attention. Then you hit them with everything you've got. It's also worth noting the economic side of this. An Iranian ballistic missile might cost $100,000 to $1 million to produce, depending on the model. An Israeli Arrow 3 interceptor costs about $3 million. Every time Iran forces Israel to intercept a sensor probe, they are winning the economic war of attrition.
The math is brutal. Israel is essentially being forced to buy its safety at a 3-to-1 or even 10-to-1 price ratio. Over months and years, that drains the national treasury and requires constant replenishment from the United States. This is why the political worldviews we hold matter. The support for Israel isn't just a moral stance, it's a logistical necessity in the face of this kind of asymmetrical warfare.
But, Herman, doesn't Iran have a limit too? They aren't exactly swimming in cash.
They aren't, but their cost per unit is significantly lower because they control the entire supply chain and use less sophisticated, though still effective components for their probes. They can afford to lose 10 missiles to map a battery if it means the 11th missile, the one with the real payload, gets through. For them, the sensor missiles are an R&D expense. For Israel, every intercept is an emergency expense.
And on the flip side, you have the Iranian domestic situation. They are in an economic crisis of their own. Every missile they fire is money that isn't going toward their failing infrastructure or their restless population. It is a high-stakes gamble for the regime in Tehran. They are betting that they can break Israeli resolve before their own country implodes from the inside.
It is a race to the bottom, but back to the technical side. I want to talk about the deflection and the CEP again. Daniel mentioned the Western Wall and the Dome of the Rock. One thing people don't realize is how much the physical environment of Jerusalem affects missile guidance. You have massive changes in elevation, you have the urban heat island effect which can mess with infrared sensors, and, as I mentioned, the GPS jamming. If Iran is trying to target specific buildings in Jerusalem, they are likely using something called terrain contour matching or digital scene mapping area correlators.
Wait, hold on. You're getting into the alphabet soup again. Explain those like I'm a sloth who just wants to eat some hibiscus.
Fair enough. Basically, the missile has a camera in its nose. It has a preloaded photo of the target. As it falls, it compares what it sees with that photo and makes tiny adjustments to its fins to line them up. But if the photo is of the Western Wall, and the Dome of the Rock is right next to it with that massive gold roof, the sensor might get confused. The gold reflects light differently. The geometry is incredibly tight. That 400-meter miss Daniel saw? That might have been the missile's brain getting dazzled by the sun reflecting off the dome.
So the very thing they are trying to avoid hitting might be the thing that is protecting the target they are actually aiming for. There is a certain poetic irony in that. But it also means that as their sensors get better, as they use AI to better differentiate between the wall and the dome, the risk of a catastrophic mistake or a successful strike goes up exponentially.
And that is why this probing phase is so dangerous. They are training their models. They are feeding the data from these misses back into their simulation environments. They are probably using models not unlike the ones we use for this podcast to predict the most likely defensive responses and find the optimal path through the interceptor screen. Imagine an AI running 10,000 simulations of a strike on Dimona based on the radar data they gathered on Tuesday night. By Wednesday, they have a more optimized flight path.
It's a sobering thought. We're talking about the gamification of Armageddon, but I think it's important to bring it back to the human element Daniel highlighted. The exhaustion is real. The stress of being a parent in that environment, trying to explain to a toddler why we have to go sit in a concrete box at 3 a.m., that is a weight no dashboard can fully capture.
You're right. We can talk about CEP and radar shadows all day, but the end result is a family in Arad or Jerusalem or Beersheba losing sleep and feeling the walls close in. The goal of our discussion today isn't to dismiss that fear, but to frame it. To show that there is a logic behind the chaos, even if that logic is cold and calculated. If you know why the siren is sounding, it doesn't make the siren quieter, but it might make the fear a little more manageable.
I think that is the best we can do. We provide the context, and hopefully, that context provides a little bit of a shield against the psychological attrition. Before we wrap up, Herman, do you have any final thoughts on the Dimona pattern? Is there anything else about those 8 to 10 polygons that we should be watching for?
Watch for the shift in timing. If they move away from the 10 p.m. to midnight window and start hitting at 4 a.m. or mid-afternoon, it means they have finished their baseline data collection and are now testing for readiness during different shifts of the Israeli military personnel. Also, watch the composition of the volleys. If they start mixing in more slow-moving drones with the fast ballistic missiles, it means they are moving toward a full-scale saturation attempt. Drones are the chaff of the modern era. They exist to make the radar screen so busy that the ballistic missile can slip through unnoticed.
Well, I for one will be keeping a very close eye on those dashboards, though hopefully from the safety of a much less interesting part of the world. Daniel, thank you for the prompt. It really forced us to look at the geometry of this conflict in a way the evening news just doesn't.
It was a deep dive I didn't know I needed. It really highlights how modern warfare is as much about the bits and bytes as it is about the fire and brimstone. We're seeing a live beta test of the next decade of conflict.
That is a wrap for today's look into the missiles. As Censor's doctrine, we hope it gave you a bit more to chew on than just the standard talking points. If you found this useful, or if you have your own observations from the front lines or the data feeds, we want to hear them.
We really do. This has been My Weird Props. Huge thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show.
If you are enjoying the deep dives we do here with Daniel's prompts, the best way to support us is to leave a review on your podcast app. It genuinely helps other curious minds find the show.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe to the RSS feed. We are also on Telegram if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops. Just search for My Weird Prompts.
Stay safe out there, stay curious, and maybe keep an eye on the sky, but keep the other eye on the data.
Well said, Corn. Until next time.
Goodbye. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and